Would Egypt and Ethiopia really go to war over water? Hello, everyone. I'm Falso Pical. Welcome to the France 24 debate. With the construction of Africa's largest dam nearly complete, Addis Ababa says it's going to start filling it next month. The question remains, how fast? Too fast worries Cairo, downstream from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Egypt, which relies on the Nile for more than 90% of its drinking water. In the middle, there's Sudan, which also sits downstream, while at the same time stands to benefit from the dam's hydroelectricity. So, on the eve of rainy season, some hard bargaining is coming to a head. That's nothing new between Egypt and Ethiopia, both of whom see the Nile's waters as an issue of national security, both of whose leaders are currently being tested at home with coronavirus. In Egypt's case, there's also a potential second front with spiking tension to the west in neighboring Libya. As for Ethiopia's reformist leader Abiy Ahmed, the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize laureate may be losing some of his veneer. What with last week's decision by Parliament to delay an August general election by at least 9 months, the opposition rejects this as being about the COVID-19 pandemic, as stated. Could both leaders be tempted to get citizens to rally round the flag at a time when they're being tested on the home front? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the dispute over the Nile's waters, and joining us, member of the Egyptian Parliament, Mohamed Salah, is with us from the Cairo suburb of Giza. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcoming as well to Megdalawit Mesai, water science researcher from the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Also in Addis, William Davidson. He is senior analyst at Crisis Group, the think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And from Washington, D.C., Mohammed Salim. He is non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. How are you?
Thank you for having me. All good.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. There have been lots of negotiations. There have at times been agreements, intermediary agreements, but now it's come to a head, it seems, with appeals made to the UN Security Council to wade in. More on the story from Jean-Emile Jamin.
A construction signaling hope for some, but for others it represents a grave concern. Colossal, with its 145-meter-high walls, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam could soon become operational. Ethiopia has announced that it will begin filling it as soon as July, a unilateral decision that has been met with anger and confusion amongst its Egyptian and Sudanese neighbors. They fear that their access to water will be cut short. The UN Security Council, meeting on Monday at the request of Egypt, called on the three countries to work together and resolve their differences peacefully. A few days earlier, the Ethiopian foreign minister had expressed his surprise that a referral to the council had even been considered.
The issue with the dam can be solved right here instead of taking it to the UN Security Council. We do not believe this is the mandate of the Security Council. The project is a developmental project. The precedence that this sets for the world in the future is very bad. This can also be considered as interfering in a sovereign nation's peaceful activity. Therefore, it is not right to do that.
The megastructure, under construction since 2013, has an expected capacity of over 6,450 megawatts, making it the most powerful hydroelectric structure in Africa. Ethiopia is banking on the reservoir to electrify and develop its country, but its strategic position on the Nile is worrying for neighboring Sudan and Egypt, which depend on the river. Egypt, for instance, draws 97% of its water needs from the Nile. Addis Ababa, meanwhile, has sought to assure its neighbors that their water shares will not be affected.
Mohamed Salah, why go to the Security Council?
I think at this stage we're sort of at a communication kind of breakdown. According to Article 35 of Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, a member nation can go to the Security Council to resolve peacefully an argument which can disrupt the peace going of two nations. So I think we are at a stage where the negotiations have been going on for long. So I think it's a signal of despair that the negotiations needs to go ahead and restart. So
Despair.
It's a look for moderation.
Despair, you say?
Correct.
So does that mean we're actually, there is the potential for an armed conflict?
No, I wouldn't put it like this, because for an armed conflict to happen, you need to have two conditions. I mean, you need to have the will, and you need to have the capability. I mean, while the capabilities are there, I don't think the will of the nations have exhausted all available options yet. So I will not, I sort of will not go there. But I think we need to reach negotiations. I mean, you're at a stage where Egypt was able to negotiate Sinai in 3 weeks, and we've been trying to negotiate this peacefully for the past 10 years, and we're not going anywhere. So I think it's just a look for moderation. We're looking for a bigger forum to moderate this case, and it's not going to be the first time for the UN to look at some sort of a border dispute or a river dispute. There have been precedents before.
And just very briefly, where can the compromise come? What will be the breakthrough? I
think there is absolutely no question, and no one is disputing Ethiopia's right for development. No one is disputing Ethiopia's right to actually go ahead and build the dam. I think we have a problem about the detail. It's just a filling time. I mean, we are looking at a nation which is, I mean, and I'll use William Davidson words, it's vulnerable to the Nile. This particular vulnerability needs to be ensured. And if we ensure this particular vulnerability, I think we can come to terms. The two nations can come to terms where you can respect Ethiopia's needs for development, as well as Egypt's dependency on water.
Mektelawit Masai, where is that room for compromise specifically?
The room for compromise is already there. As far as the dam is concerned, and as we're talking about the filling of the dam now, Ethiopia's stand on this is to fill the dam in 4 to 7 years, while initially, potentially speaking, we could fill the dam in 3 years. So there's already this concession from our side, from the Ethiopian side, to fill the dam in a longer period of time in order to downstream countries. The problem now is that we can't seem to find the balance between how long is too long, essentially, because the Egyptian side is claiming to fill the dam in 12 to 21 years, while the Ethiopian side is wanting to fill it in 4 to 7 years. 12 to 21 years is obviously a ridiculous amount of time to ask for. It's not economically feasible for Ethiopia, but 4 to 7 years, we already had reached at an agreement to fill the dam in 4 to 7 years. The issue is not technical. I beg to differ with Mohammed on this issue, that it's not about the details of the technicalities, because if it was about the details, then already in August 2018, we had almost reached that technical agreement on how to fill the dam. The issue is more political. The way I see it, it's not really about the damage that's going to come to downstream countries, but about relinquishing this hegemony and this control that Egypt historically had over the Nile, essentially. So,
yeah, without getting bogged down in the detail, the claim is made that from the Ethiopian side that Egypt wants to hark back too often to antiquated or outdated treaties regarding water management. In other words, the status quo. But the charge made by the Egyptian side to the Ethiopians is you guys want to rush ahead to establish facts on the ground that aren't there yet.
I wouldn't say delaying filling the dam, which we could potentially fill in 3 years, and offering to fill it in 4 to 7 years, rushing to put fact on the ground. And as far as the status quo in the Nile that you're talking about is concerned, we're talking about an arrangement which essentially allocates whole of the Nile water, which belongs to 11 countries in the Nile basin, between these two countries. So as far as that status quo is concerned, there is no basis on which we can stand on to argue for that agreement. When Egypt talks about its dependencies on the Nile, it's actually talking about its share according to these colonial agreements and to these mentioned. So I don't know how leaning on those skewed arrangements can help us move forward if we keep sticking to those skewed arrangements, which allocated the whole of the Nile water to 2 countries, essentially, when it belongs to 11 countries. That's where the mismatch comes in. We can't base our agreement off of those arrangements in the first place.
William Davidson, why is this coming to a head now?
Well, it's coming to a head now because the dam is reaching the stage of construction where filling can begin. And Sudan and Egypt are both opposed to Ethiopia beginning to fill the dam without an agreement. But Ethiopia says, as the dam owner, that it has the right to build the dam and also to fill the dam. So that's the reason, and that's going to happen next month. So there's that clash over whether Ethiopia needs permission or not. But I would like to be clear about one thing here. This isn't really a discussion about how long it takes to fill the dam, at least not in normal hydrological circumstances. All of the key issues relating to filling and relating to the hydrology, all of the concerns are for periods when we have below average rainfall. As Megdalawit suggested, the filling plan that Ethiopia has proposed, the first 2 years for turbine testing, and then probably another 3 years to fill the rest of the dam initially, that's agreed by all parties. And Egyptian negotiators say there is enough water in Aswan Dam to compensate during that filling period. Instead, the whole issue here is about drought, how to mitigate drought, and what sort of responsibilities does Ethiopia and the GERD have to help mitigate drought downstream. And then there is also a raft of legal disputes over dispute resolution and the legal status of any agreement on GERD, which are also somewhat connected to those disagreements over drought mitigation.
GERD, the acronym for the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. William, when you look at the world's weather over the past 10 years, more and more extreme weather, chances of the droughts you mentioned fairly high, right?
Well, I mean, I think these are obviously highly complex questions about how climate change, increased volatility will affect different parts of the world. There certainly are concerns about that volatility. So we could see an increasing frequency of drought in the Blue Nile Basin, but that's by no means assured. But let's also not forget here that GERD is a hydropower project, so it's non-consumptive. And also the fact that it has such a large reservoir, of course, means that we have water stored up to be used during a drought. So yes, there are climate change concerns, but they're not certain, and GERD can help counteract that climatic volatility as well.
And you have published a policy paper at Crisis Group where you talk about the fact that there is a short window for compromise. Explain.
Well, again, that relates to the issue of filling, which is going to begin in mid-July, and Ethiopia is absolutely set upon that, and they are very unlikely to backtrack. So we at Crisis Group are looking at how the parties can reach an agreement before filling begins, because inevitably diplomatic tensions will rise if filling goes ahead without that. So we're looking at various compromises. Can Sudan and Egypt's dams be used to help mitigate drought? How much of that needs to be mapped out in advance? Can Ethiopia agree to release a certain amount of more water from storage than it's also promised to during drought? And then what sort of legal compromises can we have? There's this issue of dispute resolution. Ethiopia rejects binding arbitration. Sudan and Egypt demand it. So could we have some form of mediation, and then perhaps followed by an African arbitration panel, which might be more acceptable to Ethiopia?
Yeah, let's talk about diplomacy for a second with you, Mohammed Salim. Several points we've seen over the past couple of weeks. The Security Council, we could talk about that more in a minute. But also, again, that role of Sudan. We noticed that there was the visit of the number 2 of the military, Hamdan Daglo, aka Hemditi, for some notorious fame during the Darfur War. He paid a trip to Addis Ababa. Where's Sudan lie in all of this?
Sudan is trying to mitigate the risk of conflict between two major African and Arab partners. Egypt is one of the most important countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Ethiopia is one of the most powerful countries in East Africa. Having a conflict is not really for the best interest of Sudan. That's number one. Number two, Sudan itself benefited from Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed mediation in the Sudanese political process and transition. So there is some sort of sense that we should help Ethiopia diplomatically. Same thing applies to Cairo, the historical relationship with Cairo, the economic support, the medical diplomacy that Cairo has been doing, especially even during COVID-19. So I think Sudan is caught in between diplomatically. Technically, of course, they are concerned. They're concerned about the water sharing. They are concerned about the electricity, the feasibility and the safety of the dam, given the fact that it's a few kilometers away from the Sudanese-Ethiopian borders. So Sudan has a lot to do in the mediation. I think also they understand the stakes are higher.
And how serious is it right now?
It's I think every single party, whether Egypt or Ethiopia, they all believe that it should only be centered around negotiations. And also, let's be frank, no one can handle a war between Cairo and Addis Ababa. It's not for the best interest for North Africa, East Africa, the entire African continent, and even Europe. These are two major countries. Each has more than 100 million people. So it's catastrophic. And I think this understanding is there. I think President Sisi and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed have been negotiating on presidents of heads of states level, and they made sure, or they really stated that we're only there for negotiations, that everything will go through negotiations. And we have seen
let's
the US.
Talk about that point, Mohamed Salim, because we talk about the United Nations, Egypt appealing to the Security Council. There's another mediator, which in ordinary times would seem very logical, the United States, since it has very good relations with the leadership of both countries. We know there was a telephone call between the Egyptian foreign minister and the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, on Wednesday. But of course, I guess as you've witnessed firsthand, these aren't ordinary times these days in Washington.
Washington is concerned, and we have seen Washington concerns manifested through whether the White House sponsored talks that happened earlier in the year, and we had technical input coming from the World Bank, and we also have seen the shuttle diplomacy and the talks that Secretary Pompeo has been doing, whether with the Egyptian counterparts or the Ethiopian counterparts.
But with a President Trump who's not that focused on foreign policy, is that concern just on the part of the State Department enough?
I think the understanding is COVID-19 has been a major distraction for most of the foreign powers, for most of the global community. So no one really paid attention to the situation and the escalation in the Nile Basin until recently, until Cairo started to make some sort of diplomatic diplomacy and pressing more for diplomacy solutions from the major powers and from the UN agencies. I think President Trump himself is definitely invested. As you mentioned, the United States is a major ally for both countries, for Cairo and Addis Ababa. And I think the last thing that the United States want is a conflict between allies.
Mohamed Fouad, your reaction to that visit to Addis Ababa by Hemditi?
I think Sudan is becoming now a major player and needs to step in the game. I think we have witnessed a big change in the Sudani position since the start of the debate. More recently, and I think in recent days and in previous hours, we've been hearing the voice of Sudan expressing also discontent about the fait accompli or the status quo position. So I think as we've spoken about those being different times, I think Sudan has also its fair share of political turmoils internally, for which it has not been focused on the particular issue. I think in recent days, more focus has been brought up. I think Sudan is also prepared to weigh in on the issue and is also expressing, as William has mentioned, some concerns about this not going in the right direction.
Egypt's leadership has its eyes these days on two fronts. There's to the south, Ethiopia, as we've just mentioned, and to the west, there's Libya, where nationalist leader Khalifa Haftar is on the back foot. This past weekend, when there was the drums of war beating when the Field Marshal, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi went to inspect the troops, the former Field Marshal, it was more in relation to Libya than Ethiopia. Let's listen.
يستطيع أن يتجاوز الخط سرت الجفرة ده أمر بالنسبة لنا خط أحمر إن أي تدخل مباشر من الدولة المصرية باتت تتوفر له الشرعية الدولية.
So right now, Mohammed Fuad, where is the concern most where you are? Are people more looking west or south?
I think there are both different issues. I think one issue is a matter of security for a particular issue. I think the Ethiopian issue is an existential issue. So we have one which could be classified as a border problem, and you don't want to have border disputes or problems on a very big front such as the Libyan front. But I think the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam remains an existential issue. So I think both issues are weighted to be different. They're important. I mean, there is nothing that takes from the importance of both issues. But I think the Ethiopian issues are more of an existential issue.
Mohammed Salim, you agree?
I echo the same notion. Basically, the water issue is existential threat to the country. We're speaking about if the dam to be unilaterally filled without an agreement, we're speaking about almost 30% loss in the agricultural land. Around 12 million people would be water insecure. And according to the UNDP, every 2% loss in Egyptian water share, that will make 1 million Egyptians affected. So 22 billion cubic meter is huge for a country to withstand. When it comes to the Libya issue, this is a main foreign policy issue. Of course, a major concern for Cairo, 100%, but the water is perceived as a matter of life and death.
Matter of life and death. Mekdalawit Masai, your reaction?
Yeah, as far as this notion of existential water goes, the Nile is existential to many of the countries, not just Egypt. It's also existential to Ethiopia. Allow me to make the case for this, because the narrative from the Ethiopian side is not fully known in the international media. Nile, at least the Ethiopian side, Ethiopian Nile, which we call Abiy in Ethiopia, accounts for more than 70% of the water resources in the country. It accounts for 2/3 of the irrigation and hydropower potential in the country. More or less, electricity production, electricity access in Ethiopia stands at less than 40%. Sanitation and water access in the country stands at less than 30%. Food and water security is still not secure in the country. So when we talk about developing the Nile or developing Abiy in Ethiopia, we're talking about ensuring basic necessities are fulfilled in the country. So as far as existential need for the water goes, the Nile is as existential as it is to Egyptians. The Nile is existential to Ethiopia as it is to Egyptians. No one was denying that if Egypt and Sudan are also dependent on the Nile. But if we rely on the skewed historical injustices that allowed these two countries to use unfair waters of the Nile, and if we hope that status quo continues and that these other riparian countries don't use the water, then I don't see where the space for compromise is. I have heard this notion of GERD as being a fait accompli project. I think that's quite ingenuous to mention that, because when Egypt and Sudan were developing their numerous infrastructures downstream of the Nile, Ethiopia and all of the upstream countries were neither notified or asked for when in fact these infrastructures were going to basically foreclose their future development endeavors. So I think especially when Ethiopia has taken these measures to include these two countries in the negotiations, and also to somehow to take in the concerns of Egypt and Sudan and actually take steps to mitigate these effects, I think it's quite disingenuous to call the fait accompli project when all of this is being done actually to take into account their concerns and their fears and their what do you call it? Their mistrusts. Another thing that I have an issue is with share of these countries. We don't have a water allocation scheme in the Nile Basin. Again, it goes back to the 1959 amendment, which basically entitles these two countries to the whole of the Nile waters. That's not a share. That's not an equitable arrangement in the basin. So when we talk about international media, especially about shares of Sudan and Egypt being decreased, we're actually perpetrating this historical injustice that has happened in the basin. So unless we have this equitable and reasonable use redistribution of water in the Nile Basin, we can't talk about anybody's share decreasing or increasing. Ethiopia is entitled to a fair share of the Nile waters, as are the other 9 riparian countries. So when that allocation is not in place, we can't really talk about other countries using the water and that use affecting the shares of these countries. Nile,
Mohammed, let me bring in Mohammed Fuad on that. You agree?
I actually have a bit of a concern about the colonial discourse or the colonial pitch that's been rampant in the media. I think what we're looking at first a respect of the need of Ethiopia to develop. Second, the respect of the Egyptian lives who have the livelihood based on the Nile. However, there needs to be a legal ground to look at this. I think a lot of the Ethiopian discourse has always been about the historical and the colony. I mean, if we quickly look at the framework that governs the actual relationship from a legal perspective, we have the 1902 treaty. And the 1902 treaty, it was signed between the Emperor of Ethiopia and Britain on behalf of Egypt. So Egypt was equally colonized. I mean, it was not that Egypt was the conqueror of the world. I mean, we've actually signed the 1902 treaty between the Emperor of Ethiopia and Britain on behalf of Egypt. Even in recent times, in 1993, the Ethiopia-Egypt framework agreement, which was signed by the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, it did quote that the two parties need to agree on the necessity of the conservation and protection of the Nile waters. In this regard, they undertake to consult and cooperate in projects that are mutually advantageous. So I think I do not want to take away from Ethiopia's needs to develop. However, I do not want to play the colonial card, because the colonial card, as I would like to put it, takes away from the legal grounding. If we take this from a legal position, I dare say that Egypt's position is legally strong. However, if we want to fall back on renegotiating historical agreements, I think it's all good and well. However, this needs not to be done and by taking the Nile hostage and enforcing the status quo. I think this is where our disagreement is. I think we do agree on the fact that both countries have rights. You also need to look at this under the umbrella of Egypt only having one Nile.
William Davidson.
Yes, thank you. So there's been a number of claims from both sides here, and it gives the impression that this is some sort of zero-sum competition. One wins, the other loses. That's not necessarily the case. So I'd just like to run through a few things that have been said. First of all, this idea that there will be agricultural losses in Egypt, that will only occur in the result of the type of scenario I was talking about in my previous answer, when you have a drought. If you do not have a drought, then there is sufficient water in the Aswan Dam to keep supplying Egypt with its needs. The GERD is a non-consumptive project. Yes, water goes into the GERD reservoir during filling and therefore does not flow downstream, but that is a temporary period. And as long as there are average flows in the river during that period, then there is no concern about agricultural losses during the 5 or 6 year filling period. It's very important that we focus on these specific disagreements. The disagreements are about how to manage drought, and they're about these various legal issues. The Ethiopian perspective about the colonial treaties, I think a lot of outside observers, such as myself and Crisis Group, have sympathy for this position. But ultimately, GERD is a non-consumptive project. So there is no question of Ethiopia taking up an allegation directly from the GERD. And also, there is the obvious fact that Sudan and Egypt, regardless of these historic treaties, they still have vital water needs. And that's, of course, why Ethiopia is negotiating about the amount of water that will be released from the dam, including during drought. Because even if these colonial era treaties did not exist, Ethiopia would still have a responsibility to run this dam in a way that does not cause critical shortages downstream in any situation, because with Ethiopia acting as a law-abiding member of the international community.
Mektalawit Masai?
I am not for an Ethiopian hegemony on the Nile. I am not for anybody's hegemony on the Nile. I understand that people of the Nile are existentially linked with the water, and every country needs the Nile. Every country needs the Nile for basically existential issues. That's where my pitch comes in. It's not just the two countries that, as the common narrative would have it out there. As I tried to explain earlier in my Ethiopia needs the Nile water for existential issues, for basic necessities. So if we say negotiations is the only way forward, first, I don't see how narratives such as if a single drop of water reduces for the Nile, all options are on the table, somehow alluding to a war and a forced conflict helps in this line of thought. If we say negotiation is the only way forward. And second, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. And second, I want to comment on the historical treaties that Mohammed mentioned earlier. The 1902 treaty was a treaty that was signed between Emperor Menelik and the UK. And that treaty does not preclude Ethiopia from using the Nile waters. I don't know why this treaty is often raised as a treaty that actually bans Ethiopia from using the water, but that treaty by no means bars Ethiopia's rights to use the waters. The 1993 agreement between Egypt and Sudan, Egypt and Ethiopia also promotes this mutual use, right? So I don't think how these treaties actually counter into this discussion now. But the reason why the colonial agreements are important is often the narrative and the discussions go to existing use of Egypt and Sudan from the Nile water, which basically alludes to the 1959 agreement. This is where my problem comes in. We can't keep discussing Nile water in terms of in light of those colonial agreements. If we allocate 55.5 billion cubic meters of water to Egypt, 18.5 billion cubic meters of water to Sudan, and 10 billion cubic meters of water for evaporation, that's basically the totality of the Nile waters. There's literally no drop of water which is left for the upstream riparian countries. That's why we can't base discussions and negotiations off of these agreements and any kind of discussion alluding to these shares and these agreements. As William mentioned earlier, GERD is a non-consumptive project. It's just a hydropower project. What happens when Ethiopia and the other upper riparian countries also want to use the water for irrigation? What happens then? Those are consumptive water uses. This is why we need to work on discussions which go beyond the dam, which go beyond a single project into a more equitable and reasonable water use. It's very interesting that Mohammed mentioned the issue of law. As far as transboundary water allocation is concerned, there are two basic tenets which dictate transboundary water management and sharing. So the first one is equitable and reasonable use for all basin countries, and then the second one is causing no significant harm. We don't have both of these things in the Nile Basin. We don't have an equitable share between the basins. And if we don't have an equitable share, we don't have the ground to talk about significant harm. Because significant harm happens when a country goes beyond its quota, its fairly designated quota, and goes on to infringe on the rights and the rights of others, causing significant harm. So without these legal frameworks in place in the Nile Basin, I don't know how we can talk about significant harm happening to these other countries and having a legal framework where we can stand on.
All right, we're running a little short on time, so I want to bring in Mohammed Salim on this. We've heard both sides, Mohammed, talk about how water is life. It's an existential concern. The Nile is essential. We know that for all the countries involved. My question is, beyond this existential threat, if the waters of the Nile run dry, or if the waters of the Nile can't be exploited, is this conversation solely about hydrology, or, as I said at the outset, is it also because the leaders of both these countries are under pressure domestically? After all, There have been negotiations for years over the Nile.
I think it's in between, meaning fast forward to 2015, both leaders signed, like Ethiopia and Egypt signed the Declaration of Principles. And that basically says that Egypt acknowledges the needs for development in Ethiopia, and also Ethiopia acknowledges that the needs to the right of water for Egypt and Sudan. So that's there because both countries understand the significance of conflict over water. But today in 2020, there are different realities, of course. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is facing a hard time in Ethiopia because of legal and constitutional mandates when it comes to elections and the government. Also, Egypt, there's also it's distressed because of a lot of problems in the region, whether it's coming from Libya, it's whether Gaza or Eastern Mediterranean. So both countries are cornered because of domestic and foreign policy priorities. And that's indeed having a say in the conversation and somehow affecting the public discussions of the water issue. And instead of advocating for middle ground, we have voices that are starting to emerge that are advocating for harder and harsher responses.
William Davidson, with again, news just come in that Parliament had approved delaying the general election by 9 months. Is there this temptation in Ethiopia to get people to rally around the flag?
Well, there might be a little bit of that, but you know, the GERD has always been a very popular project, and this issue of Ethiopia being deprived of its rights to the Nile has been a popular concern. So there's a strong consensus amongst the Ethiopian political classes and the wider public in support of the GERD and in support of the government's negotiating position, particularly to go ahead and fill the gap, to fill the dam in July. So, you know, it's clear that there's plenty of backing for the government position in Ethiopia. There isn't a great deal of support for the government to make compromises. And I think that's something which has been affecting the negotiations. But really, it's this Ethiopian resolve on the issue, which should be noted by the downstream countries and external actors, because the only way to get a deal which suits everybody is through the negotiations rather than through any diplomatic pressure, because that's just very unlikely to convince the Ethiopian government or the Ethiopian people to change their mind about this situation.
Mohamed Fouad, you're the member of parliament for Giza. We were, before the show, looking at old postcards of the pyramids. At the time, the Nile ran right past. Today, that's no longer the case, right?
Correct. That's no longer the case.
And
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, first there was the building of the Aswan Dam, and now you have had population pressure. The days of the overflow of the Nile regulating the life of agriculture in Egypt are, of course, a distant memory now.
Absolutely. I mean, even with this share of the 55.5 billion cubic meter, Egypt still suffer with water shortage, even without the dam. So, I mean, the water resources are becoming scarce. The consumption can be as much as 80 billion cubic meter. I mean, we import half of the food products, and there are a lot of initiatives going down to conserve. So it's not that Egypt that is using the water foolishly. There are a lot of initiatives in order to conserve the use of water. But just as mentioned earlier, the concerns here are real. And what we're talking about is technical matters about having reasonable assurance and how the future will be shaped. I think it goes really beyond the actual filling time, but about having the actual mechanics on how to agree on how to agree.
Mektalawit Milai, it's funny because when we talked earlier about a treaty from 1993, that's a long time ago when you see how much the population of both countries has grown. The Nile has changed where you are as well. Going forward, what do we do?
I resonate with what Mohammed said now. If we continue unilaterally maximizing the benefits of each country, there's no way forward. There's just not enough water, which is why we need to come up with a basin-wide sustainable water use mechanism, and which is why we need to move on from what the current status quo, what has been in the past. That doesn't serve us anymore. it's not just Egypt that's having higher population and higher demand. It's not just Ethiopia. It's not just Sudan. Population increase, climate change, increase in water demand. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in all countries of the Nile Basin. So the stress that we're seeing between the three countries now, it's not going to stay between the three countries. It's also going to involve all the other riparian countries as well. So which is why we need to act actively in terms of having a sustainable water use mechanism for the whole basin as a whole, and not just having this narrow and myopic ways of maximizing country benefits. There are mechanisms,
and
there are
can
ways.
I just ask, because we're short on time, can I just ask how much of this is, well, the tension that's expected when you're getting close to the point where you need to strike a deal, or could it really spiral out of control?
I still have hope. It goes back to the issue being existential to all three countries, and so not having an agreement or not reaching a consensus is not really an option. So I still have hope that these three countries can come to an arrangement. So I don't think it will spiral out of control, because we really can't afford that.
William Davidson, do you have as much hope today as you did say a month ago?
Yes, I think there's still hope for an agreement. Certainly, things are getting quite tense. We don't think at Crisis Group that this diplomatic activity, the UN Security Council, is going to get the parties any closer to a deal. So there's worrying signs in terms of the rhetoric and some of the attitudes. But it's obvious what needs to happen here. The parties need to return to trilateral negotiations with whatever formulation of observers, and they need to stay at the negotiating table until they have resolved the outstanding issues about how to manage a future long-term drought, how to resolve any future legal dispute, and about the legal status of the agreement.
Well, thank you so much, William Davidson, for joining us from the Ethiopian capital. I want to thank as well Mekdad Alawi Masai from Cairo, from Giza, from the suburbs of Cairo, Mohamed Fouad, and from Washington, D.C., Mohammed Salim. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. There's much more on our website, france24.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel. Bye for now.
With summer at our doorstep and beaches, rivers and lakes newly accessible, should we be worried that traces of the virus behind COVID-19 have been found in wastewater? With so many elements of this disease still a mystery, researchers are taking no chances. That's this week on Down to Earth.
Down to Earth on France 24 and France24.com.